You've come to the right spot. It's another edition of Lewis at Large. 60 minutes of smart talk radio is in your future, with guests from all walks of life and all points of view. And now, with this week's edition of Lewis at Large, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Welcome, everybody, to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, once again from the flight deck. And that, of course, means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment, no exception. We're going to be talking about green technology and a little bit different take here. We're going to be talking to Alexis Madrigal. He is the senior editor at The Atlantic. He's also a staff writer for Wired.com. He's a visiting scholar at the University of California in Berkeley. Regular guest on NPR, but his most important appearance will be here with us today. He has a new book called Powering the Dream, The History and Promise of Green Technology. Should be an interesting talk indeed. Alexis, how are you, my friend?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Good, you bet. We're glad to have you here. Green technology. Some people in our audience are thinking, wow, this is interesting. Some people are rolling their eyes, probably thinking, been there, done that. What possibly new could be said on this subject? And my guess is you have quite a bit to say about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I understand both reactions. I wanted to take a look at the history of green technology because I felt like so much of what was being put out and what's been put out over the past 5 years has been kind of tracking, a few developments, just right here recently. And, for good reason. The price of solar has come down a lot. Wind has really expanded in the middle of the country. But I wanted to find out, the kind of more human stories of how these things developed over the last century. I just kept hearing all these little snippets of narratives about, the number of windmills that were in the plains, numbering into the millions in the early part of the 20th century. I kept hearing about a solar industry in Southern California that existed, before World War I. There were just a lot of different pieces that I wanted to put together for people so that they'd have one place to go to find out, it's almost like the prehistory of green technology.
I'm curious as to those of us that lived through the original Earth Day back in 1970 and all those various things. I'm curious as how well, in your opinion, as a generation, have the baby boomers lived out the promise to lead a greener life or not? They may have some new technology, but they also went through a period with extremely large homes and extremely large SUVs, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a tough one, I think while most people have gotten sort of individual, like if you take an individual unit, like the number of miles a car can travel or the amount of energy it takes to heat like a cubic square foot of a house or something, people have gotten more efficient with that particular unit, but of course their cars are bigger, their houses are bigger, and so, as a society in aggregate, things haven't gone well. I mean, of course, the boomers are responsible for basically the only good environmental legislation that's been passed in the United States, so there's definitely that.
Right.
A series of bills that were actually signed by Republican presidents in the early 1970s. I think, you can kind of separate things out. I mean, baby boomers certainly have been great at some certain kinds of land stewardship. Lots more people get to enjoy the kind of nature, as we put it. But I think on the energy side of things, in particular, you have still a very dirty energy system that basically everybody benefits from, and I think that's one of the tough things about energy. Even the very people who would like to change the system the most still rely on electricity derived from burning fossil fuels.
What about just in general, from where you sit, has the United States been a net leader worldwide in green philosophy and green technology, or has it been ultimately over the years a net negative?
Well, that's a good question. We've developed a lot of the technologies, particularly in the early going, for a lot of these places. A lot of these technology types, solar and wind, but other places have tended to take the lead. So if you look at solar hot water, the big markets in China, for a long time we were trailing in wind. We were trailing Denmark, very windy place. And there's a lot of that story. I mean, governments tend to support, all governments across the world, not just our own, tend to support certain types of energy sources. And what kind of energy your country uses depends in part on what your resources are. If you've got a lot of coal, you tend to burn a lot of coal. If you've got a lot of wind, you go with wind. But it also depends on, the actual policies and institutions that governments put into play. And in this country, where we have less of an appetite, or at least less of a Congress that wants to pass these kinds of bills, there has been less support for solar energy, wind energy, than there was, say, for nuclear power in the 1950s and 1960s.
There is an organization in this town called Greenwish, and what it does is it helps raise awareness and raises money for and ultimately doles out sort of stipends to local green organizations. I don't want to say it's a green technology organization like the United Way, but it in some ways it mirrors that, and it represents to me what is sort of typical of the green industries and the green world, so to speak. There's lots and lots of people very, very interested, very passionate about this. There doesn't seem to be a green tech or a green industry leader, so to speak. Am I wrong on that, or is that true?
Well, it depends on, I think one of the things that's happened is it really depends on how we define green. I mean, if we're talking about, are there leaders in the wind industry? For sure. Is there, is First Solar, a leader in the solar industry? Definitely. But there's a lot of other, particularly at the community scale, there's a lot of other things that you can do on the green side of things, making things more efficient, building homes in ways that, capture as much energy from the sun as possible, stuff like that. And in those things, it's much more mom and pop. There isn't like a national leader of energy efficiency conversions for old industrial factories and things like that.
Right.
And I think that's why you see at those scales a lot of that kind of activity. I mean, on the other hand, so, in some ways you'd say like, oh, well, this isn't all that great. It'd be better if you could have, these kind of leaders who are pushing things forward. But, really on the national level, it's kind of a grim situation. You have basically Republicans blocking the passage of most kind of support for green energy at the national level. You have at the international level, people haven't been able to get a treaty together on any kind of carbon tax. And so what's happened is a lot of the energy and excitement has pushed down to the metro level and the community level, where you see cities and communities kind of trying to do whatever it is that they can. And I think it cuts both ways. It's a great thing. It engages people at the local level where they can see the impact that they're making. On the other hand, this is a global scale problem and eventually will require people to communicate and cooperate across the globe.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis here from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Our guest this segment, Alexis Madrigal. He is the senior editor at The Atlantic. He's also a staff writer for Wired.com. He was a visiting scholar at the University of Cal Berkeley, and he's a regular guest on NPR. His latest work is called Powering the Dream, the History and Promise of Green Technology. Alexis, let's start to focus a little bit here on the book. As you look back on the history, in your opinion, what was the big winner and what was the big dud or big loser? Loser sounds a little bit negative, but what was the big thing maybe that didn't fulfill the promise?
Yeah, well, I think one of the great stories of renewable energy history happened right there in Kansas and also in Nebraska and up in Illinois. People built an incredible number of water pumping windmills. These are windmills that, you probably recognize. They have the kind of curved metal blades, and they say oftentimes air motor, AER motor on them. And there was an industry that developed in the latter half of the 19th century of just making tons of water pumping windmills. I mean, they helped railroads, which, if you have a steam engine, you basically need the heat from burning something, and then you need water to make steam. And so the windmills were how railroads could get lots of water. It also helped farmers. Individuals built their own windmills often. In fact, there was a guy who spent a bunch of time crisscrossing Nebraska in the 1890s looking at all the different types of windmill designs that people of the time had literally built with their own hands, like with whatever was to hand. It's kind of an amazing story about American resilience and just people on the plains who figured out how to convert the wind into water. And I think that one's just great. I mean, there's been one estimate of how many of these windmills there were, and I mean we're looking 6 million, which is you figure there's not that many people in the United States around at that time, and that's a lot of windmills. So this used to be just an absolute dominant feature of life, and anytime you see an old photo of a Midwestern town, there'll be the skyline is basically defined by the windmills.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. What and again, as you did your research, any big super surprise to you? Anything you found that thought, wow, I had no idea I would uncover something like this?
Yeah, at least for me, it was just how deep the roots really go on some of these industries. I mean, if you were to go to China or some countries in the Middle East, you'd see tons and tons of these solar hot water heaters on people's roofs. I mean, literally, we're talking tens of millions. And that industry basically got its start in Southern California in the early 20th century. I mean, there were people producing these kinds of solar hot water heaters with basically the same design that you see on the roofs of China today. You see people using it again in Miami in the middle of the century, which is a perfect climate for solar hot water. And so I think that was really a big surprise to me, just that, basically that's the only technology you can say people basically took that off the shelf and started, cranking out millions of them. And that, continues to be a very viable industry, just not really here in the United States.
What I'm curious as to, and again, this isn't meant to be negative or pointing a finger at a particular industry, but in your opinion, undoubtedly there are industries or certain parts of at least American industry that are fighting some of the move towards green. Are there any in particular that you think are the particular corporate bandits? Or is everybody at least publicly putting on the face of, yeah, me too?
Well, I think, I mean, it's kind of funny. It's just what you would expect, I mean, basically, if you generate electricity as your business and you see a competitor coming up that generates electricity, you're going to fight it. And I think, it's not, again, it's not like you really blame corporations for being corporations, but that's what they do. And so I think, you've seen the coal industry in particular fight things, and I think, coal is just a really tough thing. It's a really cheap power source. It allows people, particularly in that kind of southeastern part of the country, to have really low electricity rates, and that means low electricity bills for individuals. But the pollution that it causes ends up basically dumping the cost on the rest of society. And what that ends up meaning is that people who use a lot of electricity that's very cheap are basically subsidized by the rest of everybody else who has to deal with the healthcare costs that causes, with the environmental damage that causes. And I think, that's not what coal companies want you to think about their product.
Indeed. Again, if you just joined us, Alexis Madrigal is our guest. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic. Very interested in green, enough so to put together work called Powering the Dream, A History and Promise of Green Technology. Let's, we've talked a little bit about the past. Let's take the spyglass and look towards the future. What do you see as exciting emerging partnerships, technology, et cetera, that's on its way?
Well, I think, the most exciting thing overall is just the falling cost of solar electricity. I mean, I think if you just look at, the cost curve of the way that solar photovoltaics have come down in price, I mean, that just is exciting. It's a technology that's just improved orders of magnitude from the 1950s to today. And the cost has fallen. It's a really comparable cost curve, actually, to what happened with traditional electricity production, from 1900 to 1960, where you saw this incredible fall in price. And I think, so that's really the most exciting thing going right now. I mean, the wind is obviously, that's an established industry. People know how it works. People know how to make money on it. People know how to service the machines. And that's probably a close second.
I'm curious as to, when you did your research, boy, where do you start? I mean, what a gigantic subject. Probably to some people it feels like it's newer, but it really isn't, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I just went back to, how industrialization got started here in this country. I think if you look at the problems that we're having, a lot of it comes down to the fact that we make lots of stuff, and when you make stuff, it requires lots of energy, and where do you get the energy? Then right now, it's fossil fuels. But, in the 19th century in the U.S., particularly in the Northeast, they used a ton of water power, and that generated a whole bunch of different consequences from the coal power that was used, say, in England, right? I mean, Americans have a story in their minds about how industrialization happened that we basically borrowed from the British, which is that we got a bunch of coal, and with that coal, we got a bunch of factories, and that's how it went. But in the U.S., people saw what was happening in British towns and didn't really want American towns to look like Manchester in the UK. And so from the very beginning, Americans were trying to create a better kind of industrialization, and in some places managed to do it.
What, again, in your opinion, do you see crossing industry holding hands with science and coming together, and with government too, sort of tossed in there, sort of these sort of corporate government partnerships?
Yeah. I mean, I think, one thing that's fascinating is I think people think that's a new thing too, but really, in the history of energy, basically it's always been government working with scientists, working with corporations to create whatever systems we have now. I mean, it's like, just if you go to any of the industries that currently exist, it's pretty much how it looks. And if you think about it, I mean, it almost has to be that way, just because let's even take the kinds of things that seem like they wouldn't work that way, like oil. You still need the government to regulate the oil pipelines and figure out, a lot of the stuff that we've heard recently about, fracking and horizontal drilling and all these other technologies. A lot of those things stem from government research programs that went on for decades. And it really, I think a lot of people are like, well, government just needs to get out of the way. I mean, the reason government never gets out of the way with energy is that it's absolutely critically important to national security and all these other things. Right. And so the government's never going to get out of the way because they need to secure energy supplies for, at a really basic level, for the military. And a lot of the long-time relationship between government and the energy industry has been around making sure that they would have adequate supplies of that stuff. So I think that's one reason why you've seen places like the Navy. The Navy's probably like the green craziest organization in the country. And it's because they know that over time they need to be able to deal in a world where different types of fossil fuel resources might become more or less expensive.
Right. And trying, again, everybody probably at this point is Republican, Democrat, Independent, et cetera, is up for and on board with trying to become less dependent on foreign oil, for sure, at least foreign energy sources. What, Alexis, as we start to wind down here just a little bit, look back, we asked several of our guests this, what sort of is the headline? What's the one big, powerful thought that came out of the research that you did, and what did you walk away with sort of a new enlightenment on?
Sure. I mean, I think, the headline is just that we could, in fact, right now already have a much greener energy system that, we created this by making a series of decisions about what was important to us as society. And, our ancestors were solving a different set of problems than we're solving today. And so in a lot of ways, they didn't consider a lot of the problems that the system that they created has generated. But the upside of that is we're still a society that can make those kinds of decisions, and then coming together, people can say, hey, we're trying to, optimize for new things. We're trying to solve new problems, and therefore we want a new energy system that is different from the one that we currently have.
Well, the work, again, it's an interesting one called Powering the Dream, the History and Promise of Green Technology. Its author, Alexis Madrigal, has been our guest. He's senior editor at The Atlantic, also is a regular guest on NPR. Alexis, green technology, big subject. How can people find more about the book and also about just green technology in general?
Sure. Yeah, they can go to theatlantic.com, where I continue to write about energy issues. And, the book, it's on Amazon. It's a good place to get it.
Got it. Hey, listen, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. And what's the next piece of literature you got in mind?
I'm working on a book about people making life. So like biologists, regular people having babies, just what it is to make life.
What it is to make life, indeed. Well, we would love to have you back and talk about that as well in the future.
Thanks so much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.